The sun was setting over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the tree-lined streets of this peaceful suburban neighborhood. Special Agent Lee, an experienced FBI investigator with 15 years of service, was driving his understated gray sedan through the area. He'd spent months building a case around suspected corruption in the local police department, carefully gathering evidence while maintaining his cover. The peaceful evening drive suddenly changed when flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Lee checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit. With the precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times before, he pulled over to the curb, positioning his car perfectly. Through his mirror, Lee watched Officer Barrett approach, noting how the officer's hand was already resting on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that spoke volumes about his mindset. Lee kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his movements deliberate and calm. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, his tone sharp and unnecessarily aggressive. The lack of any greeting or professional courtesy didn't go unnoticed by Lee, who had conducted countless traffic stops himself during his early days in law enforcement. "Good evening, officer," Lee responded politely, reaching slowly for his documents. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Barrett's response came with a sneer. "You made a suspicious turn back there. People like you need to learn how things work in this neighborhood." The loaded phrase, "people like you," hung in the air. Lee maintained his composure while internally noting every word, every gesture. His FBI training had taught him to observe and remember details, and right now, those skills were painting a troubling picture. Lee handed over his valid license and registration, documents that had passed scrutiny at federal government levels. "Everything's in order, officer. I drive through here regularly." Barrett barely glanced at the documents before scoffing. "These look fake to me. Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, I assure you those documents are valid," Lee stated calmly, knowing his every word was being recorded by both Barrett's body camera and his own hidden recording device. "I'd be happy to explain." "I said get out." Barrett's voice rose sharply, his hand tightening on his holster. "Don't make me tell you again." Lee noticed a second patrol car pulling up. This situation was escalating quickly, but he remained steady. Years of undercover work had taught him to read situations like this. Sometimes, the best way to expose corruption was to let it play out while maintaining a clear record of events. As Lee carefully stepped out of his car, he could see neighborhood residents beginning to notice the commotion. Several had stopped to watch, some holding up phones to record the scene. Barrett's aggressive behavior was creating exactly the kind of attention that poor police conduct often attracted. "Hands where I can see them," Barrett barked, though Lee's hands were already raised to shoulder height. "You think you can just drive through here, acting suspicious?" "Sir, I'm simply trying to understand the reason for this stop," Lee replied, his voice steady and professional. "I've provided valid identification and—" "Shut up." Barrett cut him off, moving to grab his handcuffs. "You're being detained for suspicious activity and possession of fraudulent documents." As the cool metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Lee remained silent, knowing that every second of this interaction was building an airtight case. The second officer stood back, watching but not intervening, another detail that would prove significant later. What Officer Barrett didn't realize was that his traffic stop had just become a key piece of evidence in a federal investigation. His actions, driven by prejudice and poor judgment, were about to trigger a chain of events that would reshape the entire department. As Lee was led to the patrol car, he caught glimpses of more residents filming the scene. In an age where police misconduct often went viral, this incident would have been troubling enough on its own. But given Lee's true identity, it was about to become something much bigger, a catalyst for real change. The patrol car's door slammed shut, and Lee sat quietly in the back seat. Through the window, he could see Barrett smugly returning to his vehicle, clearly pleased with himself. In the growing darkness, the red and blue lights continued to flash, illuminating the faces of concerned onlookers. This quiet suburban street had just become the starting point of a story that would soon make headlines across the country. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Barrett returned to his patrol car, Lee's documents in hand. Through the patrol car's window, Lee could see Barrett speaking into his radio, likely running the license through the system. What should have been a routine check was about to become anything but routine. Barrett strode back to Lee's car with an exaggerated swagger that spoke of misplaced confidence. His flashlight beam swept across the interior of Lee's vehicle, searching for anything that could justify his actions. The light lingered on a small briefcase in the backseat, and Barrett's expression shifted to one of suspicious interest. "Step out of the vehicle now," Barrett commanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. More neighbors had gathered on their porches, drawn by the commotion. The blue and red lights painted their concerned faces in alternating colors as they watched the scene unfold. Lee maintained his professional demeanor as he carefully opened his car door. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I want to point out that you haven't given me a valid reason for." "I said out," Barrett interrupted, his hand again moving to his holster. "You just keep making this worse for yourself. Hands where I can see them." A young couple walking their dog had stopped on the sidewalk, phones raised to record the interaction. Barrett noticed them, but seemed beyond caring about the audience he was attracting. His focus was entirely on Lee, who stood calmly with his hands raised. "These documents are obviously fake," Barrett announced loudly, waving Lee's license. "No way someone like you drives a car like this in this neighborhood." The racist undertone of Barrett's words hung heavy in the evening air. Several onlookers exchanged glances, their discomfort visible. One elderly man shook his head sadly, while a woman nearby covered her mouth in shock at the officer's blatant prejudice. "Officer, those documents were issued by the state," Lee explained patiently. "If you run them through your system, you'll find they're completely legitimate. I'd be happy to wait while you verify." "Stop talking," Barrett snapped, moving closer. "You're really starting to irritate me with all these excuses. Put your hands behind your back." A second patrol car pulled up, its headlights illuminating the scene from a different angle. Officer Thompson stepped out, a younger officer who looked uncertain about the situation he was walking into. He approached slowly, taking in the gathering crowd and the tension in Barrett's stance. "Everything okay here?" Thompson asked, his eyes darting between his fellow officer and Lee. "Just dealing with a suspicious individual," Barrett replied, his tone dismissive. "Probably using stolen identification. You know how these people are." Thompson's discomfort was visible, but he didn't challenge his senior officer. Instead, he positioned himself to help control the growing crowd of onlookers who were now openly murmuring their disapproval. Lee stood perfectly still as Barrett roughly patted him down, knowing that every second of this interaction was being recorded not only by the officer's body cameras, but by at least a dozen citizen phones. The weight of the hidden FBI recording device in his jacket pocket felt particularly significant now. "What's in the briefcase?" Barrett demanded, pointing his flashlight at Lee's car again. "Work documents," Lee replied truthfully, though he carefully omitted mentioning exactly what kind of work they related to. Nothing illegal or suspicious. Barrett's face twisted into a sneer. "We'll see about that. Thompson, watch him while I search the vehicle." "Sir," Lee spoke up, his voice clear and steady, "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. You have no probable cause, and I know my rights under the Fourth Amendment." This seemed to enrage Barrett further. "Oh, so you're a lawyer now? Think you know the law better than me?" He stepped closer, attempting to intimidate Lee with his physical presence. "Your kind always think you can talk your way out of everything." The crowd had grown larger, their phones recording every word. Someone in the back called out, "This isn't right," but was quickly hushed by others, though their faces showed they agreed. Barrett reached for his handcuffs, the metal gleaming in the streetlight. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and possession of fraudulent documents." "I'm not resisting," Lee stated calmly, allowing himself to be handcuffed while maintaining his dignity. "And I want to be clear that I'm cooperating under protest. This is an unlawful arrest." As Barrett roughly secured the handcuffs, he was oblivious to the fact that his actions were doing more than just violating one person's rights. They were providing crucial evidence for an investigation that would soon shake the entire department to its core. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as Lee was led to the patrol car, his head held high despite the humiliation Barrett was attempting to inflict. In the distance, more patrol cars were arriving, their sirens piercing the evening quiet. What started as a simple traffic stop had escalated into something that would soon prove to be a turning point for the entire community. The back seat of the patrol car was cold and uncomfortable as Lee sat quietly, watching Officer Barrett argue with his colleague through the window. Officer Thompson was gesturing towards the crowd, clearly concerned about the number of witnesses filming the incident. The flashing lights continued to paint the scene in alternating shades of red and blue, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. "We need to clear these people out," Barrett's voice came through the slightly opened window. "That interfering with police business." A teenage girl in the crowd spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "We're not leaving. You can't just arrest someone for nothing." Several others nodded in agreement, phones still recording. Lee observed everything with the trained eye of an investigator. He noticed how Barrett's hand kept twitching toward his weapon, how Thompson's body language showed his growing discomfort with the situation. These details would all become important later. Through the windshield, Lee could see more patrol cars arriving. The quiet suburban street now looked like a crime scene, though the only crime being committed wasn't by the person in handcuffs. A sergeant stepped out of one of the new vehicles, surveying the scene with obvious confusion. "What's the situation here?" the sergeant asked, approaching Barrett. His nameplate read Wilson. Barrett straightened up, clearly trying to justify his actions to his superior. "Suspicious individual with fake ID, sir. Resisting arrest and giving attitude." The sergeant glanced at the growing crowd, then at Lee sitting calmly in the back of the patrol car. "And you verified the ID is fake?" "Well, no, but look at him," Barrett gestured dismissively. "No way he belongs in this neighborhood. Plus, he's got some kind of briefcase in his car. Could be drugs or weapons." The sergeant's expression tightened slightly. "Did you establish probable cause before the search?" "He's being evasive," Barrett insisted, his voice rising. "These people always have something to hide." Lee could see the sergeant's face change as he registered Barrett's openly racist language. But instead of addressing it directly, Wilson simply nodded toward the patrol car. "Let's get him to the station. Process him by the book." The crowd's murmurs grew louder at this. An elderly man stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I've lived here 40 years, he called out. "Never seen anything like this. Shame on you all." Barrett turned toward the crowd, his face reddening. "Step back, sir. This is a police matter." The old man stood his ground, supported by others in the crowd. "Everything's a police matter when you want it to be, isn't it?" Lee watched as Thompson shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his duty and his conscience. The young officer kept glancing at Lee, then at Barrett, then at the crowd. His internal struggle was visible on his face. The sergeant took control of the situation. "Thompson, you drive this unit back to the station. Barrett, you ride with me. Let's wrap this up clean and professional." As Thompson got into the driver's seat, Lee caught him checking the rearview mirror, probably trying to get a read on his passenger. The young officer's hands were tense on the steering wheel. "Sir," Thompson spoke quietly as they pulled away from the curb. "I want you to know, this doesn't feel right." Lee maintained his professional demeanor. "Just do your job, officer. Everything will be clear soon enough." The drive to the station was tense and quiet. Through the window, Lee could see people on the sidewalks stopping to watch the patrol car pass, some already holding up phones. In today's world, news of police misconduct spread fast. At each red light, Thompson seemed to grow more nervous, occasionally glancing back at Lee. The young officer's conscience was clearly bothering him, but like many in his position, he felt powerless to challenge the system he was part of. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Lee noticed several officers gathering near the entrance, likely alerted by radio chatter about the arrest. Their curious faces watched the patrol car approach, unaware that they were about to become part of a much bigger story. Barrett's car pulled in right behind them, and Lee could see the officer already strutting toward the station entrance, probably planning how he would write up this arrest to justify his actions. The sergeant followed more slowly, his expression suggesting he knew this situation was about to become complicated. What none of them realized was that every minute of this ordeal was being carefully documented, not just by civilian phones and body cameras, but by equipment that would soon turn this routine arrest into a federal case. As Lee was led toward the station doors, he remained calm, knowing that justice would soon be served in a way Officer Barrett never expected. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Lee sat handcuffed to the processing desk. Around him, the usual evening activities of the station continued, phones ringing, officers walking back and forth with paperwork, the occasional raised voice from the holding cells down the hall. Officer Barrett was at a nearby desk, typing his report with 2 fingers, occasionally glancing over with a self-satisfied smirk. He seemed to be enjoying himself, taking his time to craft what he probably thought would be a perfectly justified arrest report. "Let's see," Barrett muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "suspicious behavior, failure to comply, possible fraudulent identification." He was putting on a show for his colleagues, several of whom were watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. The young officer Thompson stood near the water cooler, unable to keep still. He kept looking between Lee and Barrett, then at his sergeant, who was making phone calls in his office. Something about this situation clearly wasn't sitting right with him. The station doors swung open, and a blast of cool evening air swept through the room. 2 people walked in, a man and a woman in plain business attire. They moved with the unmistakable authority of federal agents, their badges already in hand. "Evening," the woman said, her voice carrying across the room. "I'm Supervisory Special Agent Chen. This is Special Agent Rivera. We're here about your recent arrest." The typing at Barrett's desk stopped abruptly. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. "How did you?" Barrett started to ask, but Chen was already walking past him, straight to where Lee sat. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew the answer. With swift, practiced movements, she unlocked the handcuffs. Barrett stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Hey, you can't do that. That's my prisoner." He had fake ID and was resisting. "Special Agent Lee," Rivera interrupted, his voice firm but professional, "has been conducting an ongoing federal investigation into civil rights violations and police misconduct in this district. His identification, which you claimed was fake, was issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The color drained from Barrett's face so quickly that Thompson took a step forward, probably thinking the officer might faint. Around the room, other officers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. That's impossible," Barrett stammered. "He was acting suspicious. I was just following procedure." "Following procedure." Lee spoke for the first time since entering the station, his voice steady and clear. "Like when you pulled me over without cause? Or when you attempted to search my vehicle without probable cause? Or perhaps when you made several racist remarks that were captured on both your body camera and my own recording device?" The sergeant emerged from his office, taking in the scene. "Federal investigation?" he asked, his face ashen. "Why wasn't I informed?" "That's rather the point of an undercover operation," Chen replied dryly. She turned to address the room at large. "As of this moment, all materials relating to this arrest are evidence in a federal investigation. Body camera footage, arrest reports, radio communications, everything. No one leaves until we've secured it all." Barrett sank back into his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. His hands trembled as he looked at his half-written report, now a piece of evidence that would be used against him. Thompson stepped forward, straightening his uniform. "Ma'am," he addressed Agent Chen, "I was present for the arrest." "I know I should have done something," said something. "You'll have your chance to make a statement," Rivera assured him. "In fact, we'll be conducting interviews with everyone here over the next few days." The station had gone completely quiet except for the constant buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant ringing of unanswered phones. Officers who had witnessed Barrett's behavior over the years exchanged nervous glances, knowing this was just the beginning. Lee stood up, straightening his jacket. The briefcase Barrett had been so suspicious of contained files documenting months of similar incidents, a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored or covered up. "Officer Barrett," Lee said quietly, "you should know that your actions tonight weren't just wrong, they were the final piece of evidence we needed. Your body camera footage will be particularly interesting to the Civil Rights Division." Barrett opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face had taken on the look of someone watching their entire career crumble before their eyes. As if on cue, more FBI agents entered the station, carrying equipment for gathering evidence and conducting interviews. The night was far from over, and for many in the room, it marked the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. The next morning, the police station hummed with nervous energy. FBI agents had set up a temporary command center in the conference room, with computers, printers, and stacks of files covering every available surface. The blinds were drawn, but everyone knew what was happening behind those closed doors. Officer Thompson sat in an interview room, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Agent Lee and Agent Chen reviewed his statement about last night's events. "And you say this wasn't the first time you noticed Officer Barrett behaving this way?" Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Thompson stayed into his coffee cup. "I've only been on the force 2 years, but there were signs. Comments he'd make when no one else was around. The way he'd get excited about patrolling certain neighborhoods." Down the hall, other officers waited their turn, each one knowing they'd have to account for what they'd seen and what they'd chosen to ignore. The thin blue line was starting to crack under the weight of federal scrutiny. In another room, Rivera sat with the police captain, whose face had aged 10 years overnight. Spread across the table between them were complaint forms dating back 5 years, all involving Barrett, all mysteriously marked as resolved or unfounded. These complaints were filed through proper channels, Rivera noted, his voice level but firm. "Can you explain why none of them resulted in disciplinary action?" The captain wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "You have to understand the pressure we're under. If we investigated every complaint like this one." Rivera pulled out a form. A mother of 3, pulled over 4 times in 2 months by Officer Barrett. No citations issued, just repeated stops. Or this one, an elderly man grabbed roughly during a routine ID check while walking in his own neighborhood. Outside the station, news vans had begun to gather. The story had broken on social media the night before, with videos of Lee's arrest going viral. Local reporters stood in front of the station, delivering updates to their morning audiences. Sources tell us that what began as a routine traffic stop has expanded into a federal investigation of systematic discrimination within the department, one reporter said into her microphone. The FBI has confirmed they've been building this case for months. Back inside, Lee reviewed footage from Barrett's body camera history. Each video showed a pattern, different faces, different days, but the same discriminatory treatment. Some faces showed fear, others showed resignation, as if they'd been through this too many times before. Agent Lee, a junior FBI analyst, called from her laptop. "You need to see this." She pulled up a spreadsheet of traffic stop data. Barrett's stop rate for minorities was 4 times higher than other officers, and look at the timestamps. He was deliberately targeting people during work commute hours. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Barrett hadn't been acting alone. He'd been enabled by a system that turned a blind eye to discrimination. The chain of negligence reached up through the ranks. In the break room, officers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some looked worried, others seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally coming out. A few were already meeting with union representatives, preparing for the storm they knew was coming. "I tried to report him last year," one officer confided to another. "Wrote up a detailed complaint about how he treated this young couple during a traffic stop. Next thing I know, I'm working midnight shifts for 3 months straight." The investigation spread beyond Barrett's immediate supervisor to the Internal Affairs Division. Files were pulled, interviews conducted, and a picture emerged of systematic suppression of complaints. Officers who spoke up found themselves assigned to undesirable shifts or passed over for promotions. By late afternoon, Agent Chen stood in front of a wall covered in photos, documents, and sticky notes, a visual representation of years of unchecked bias and abuse of power. Red strings connected related incidents, showing how deep the problem went. "This isn't just about one officer anymore," she said to Lee, who stood studying the wall. "This is about a culture that protected him. Every ignored complaint, every buried report, every officer who looked the other way, they're all part of the problem." Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown. Community leaders had arrived, demanding answers and accountability. The department's public information officer stood at a podium, sweating under the lights as he tried to stick to his prepared statement about cooperating fully with federal investigators. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a single traffic stop was now shining a light on years of institutional failure. And it was far from over. This was just the beginning of a long process of uncovering the truth and demanding change. 3 weeks after the arrest that changed everything, the city courthouse was packed. Every wooden bench in the courtroom was filled with community members, reporters, and police officers, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Barrett sat at the defendant's table, his once proud posture now slumped and defeated. His police uniform had been replaced by a gray suit that seemed a size too big, making him look smaller than anyone remembered. His attorney shuffled papers nervously beside him. The federal prosecutor stood before the judge, her voice clear and confident as she presented the evidence. On a large screen, Barrett's body camera footage played silently, a damning collection of incidents showing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Your Honor, the prosecutor addressed the court. What we've uncovered goes beyond a single traffic stop. Over the past 3 years, Officer Barrett conducted over 500 traffic stops. Our analysis shows that 82% of these stops targeted minority drivers, despite them making up only 23% of the local population. In the gallery, some of Barrett's former victims sat watching. Their faces showed a mix of emotions: vindication, sadness, and for some, a quiet triumph. One elderly gentleman gripped his cane tightly, nodding as each piece of evidence was presented. The young officer, Thompson, took the stand as a witness. His testimony about the department's culture of silence drew sharp intakes of breath from the audience. If you spoke up, there were consequences, he explained. Not official ones, just little things. Bad shifts, missed promotions, no backup when you called for it. The FBI's investigation had uncovered dozens of buried complaints, each one now carefully documented and presented to the court. Agent Lee sat in the front row, watching as months of undercover work finally bore fruit. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, we have evidence that senior officers actively discouraged the filing of formal complaints. Citizens were intimidated, paperwork was lost, and officers who attempted to report misconduct faced retaliation. During a break in proceedings, reporters gathered outside the courthouse steps. The story had gone national, with major networks covering what they called a landmark case of police accountability. Back inside, Barrett's attorney tried to paint his client as a product of poor training and departmental culture. My client was simply following established patterns of behavior that, while regrettable, were tacitly approved by his superiors. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and piercing eyes, wasn't buying it. Are you suggesting, counselor, that your client bears no personal responsibility for his actions? That racist behavior becomes acceptable if others engage in it as well? As the day wore on, more evidence emerged. Financial records showed how complaints were settled quietly, buried under non-disclosure agreements. Training records revealed how diversity training recommendations had been repeatedly ignored or undermined. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution played the audio from Lee's arrest. Barrett's voice, dripping with prejudice, filled the courtroom. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust as they listened to the unnecessary escalation of a routine traffic stop. The defense would have you believe this was just business as usual, the prosecutor said in her closing argument. And perhaps that's the most damning thing of all, that such blatant discrimination had become routine, accepted, even expected. Outside, protesters held signs demanding reform. Community leaders gave interviews about the need for change. The case had become a symbol of something larger, a turning point in the relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. Late in the afternoon, Barrett's former supervisor took the stand. His testimony revealed a department-wide system of covering up misconduct. We thought we were protecting our own, he admitted, looking years older than his age. Instead, we were protecting behavior that destroyed public trust. The judge's ruling was clear and unequivocal. Barrett would face federal civil rights charges, and the department would be placed under federal oversight. But perhaps more importantly, the case had cracked open a system that had protected bad behavior for far too long. As the court adjourned, Lee watched Barrett being led away by marshals. The former officer's face showed something that had been missing during his years of unchecked power: accountability. The consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him, and with the system that had enabled him for so long. 6 months after the landmark court decision, the police department looked very different. The old guard had been replaced by new leadership committed to real change. The building itself even felt different. The dark-tinted windows had been replaced with clear glass, a symbolic gesture of transparency that the new chief had insisted upon. In the main training room, Agent Lee stood before a fresh class of police recruits. The room was diverse, reflecting the community these future officers would serve. On the screen behind him, dashcam footage from his own arrest played silently. "This footage isn't meant to shame anyone," Lee explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's meant to teach. Every interaction with the public is a chance to either build trust or break it. The choice is yours to make every single time." The recruits watched intently as Lee walked them through the incident, pointing out each moment where different choices could have led to different outcomes. In the back of the room, Officer Thompson, now promoted to training supervisor, nodded along. "The biggest mistake wasn't the initial stop," Lee continued. "It was the failure to see me as a human being. That's where it always starts, when we stop seeing each other's humanity." Down the hall, the newly established Civilian Oversight Board was in session. Community members from all walks of life sat around a large table, reviewing body camera footage from recent police interactions. Their discussions were frank, sometimes heated, but always focused on improvement. "Look at this traffic stop," one board member pointed out. The officer took time to explain everything she was doing. That's exactly the kind of transparency we want to see. The department's new training program had become a model for other cities. Every officer now went through extensive bias recognition training, but it went beyond just sitting through lectures. They spent time in the communities they served, meeting people, hearing their stories, understanding their fears and hopes. In the break room, a group of officers discussed their recent community outreach event. They'd organized a basketball game between police and local teenagers, followed by a cookout where they could talk openly about improving police-community relations. "One of the kids told me he used to be scared every time he saw a police car," a young officer shared. "But now he waves when we drive by." That's the kind of change we need to see. The department's new complaint system was fully transparent, with every report tracked and investigated. A public website showed the status of each investigation, and quarterly meetings were held to discuss trends and solutions. "Remember," Lee told the recruits, "your badge isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of public trust. And trust has to be earned every single day, through every single interaction." In the chief's office, a meeting was underway with local civil rights leaders. They weren't there to protest this time, but to collaborate on new initiatives. The walls that had once displayed only police achievements now showed community awards and thank you letters from residents. "Our goal isn't just to prevent another incident like Barrett's," the chief explained. "It's to create a department that truly serves and protects everyone equally." The changes weren't just superficial. New technology had been implemented to flag potential problem behaviors before they escalated. Regular psychological evaluations helped officers deal with job stress in healthy ways. Community feedback was actively sought and acted upon. Outside the station, the neighborhood had changed too. Where people once hurried past with their heads down, they now stopped to chat with officers on patrol. Children no longer ran inside when police cars drove by. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. Back in the training room, Lee wrapped up his session with a question that made every recruit think deeply about their chosen profession. "Why did you want to become a police officer?" The answers varied, but they all shared a common theme: a genuine desire to help people and make their community better. It was the same answer Lee himself had given years ago, and it remained the foundation of good policing. As the sun set over the station, Thompson and Lee stood in the parking lot, watching officers from the old and new guard changing shifts. The department's transformation wasn't complete. Real change takes time, but the direction was clear. "You know what the best part is?" Thompson said, looking at a group of officers chatting with local residents across the street. "It's not just about following new rules or policies. People are actually starting to get it. They're understanding why this matters. Lee nodded, remembering that night 6 months ago. One traffic stop had sparked a change that would impact countless lives. It was proof that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, and that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can transform an entire community.